may receive this message. In your name we pray. Amen.
I'd like to welcome you guys to Destination Community Church. Thank you for being with us today. It's turned a little bit colder outside. It's been nice the last few days, but it's cold again. I'd like to ask you guys this morning to consider something very important, and it's this. What is at the heart of the Jesus movement? When we talk about the Jesus movement, we're talking about Jesus in the world and what Jesus does. So what is at the heart of the Jesus movement? I'm not referring to the theology of the cross. We understand that the cross is the centerpiece of what we do, what we worship, what we celebrate, what has saved us. We know all that. But what is actually at the heart of the Jesus movement? I'd like to make the argument that it's this. It's the process of making disciples. This is the thing that we must be focused on more than anything else in this world, is this process of making disciples. Sometimes our methods and our mindset drift from this, listen to this, because it's easier to produce quick numbers than it is to take the tedious, hard process of developing small groups of people. And numbers make us all feel really good. It's easier to attract crowds to religious consumerism than to invest in small groups of people over large periods of time. The American way, continual production and consumption over and over and over again. More. The Jesus way, be present and take up that easy yoke. It's very different than what we see in the church a lot, because a lot of times churches now are operating the same way that corporations are operating. We are in the third part of a vision series titled Reach, Serve, Grow. In the first couple weeks, Pastor Lee talked about what the reach portion of our vision meant. Then he talked last week about what the serve portion of our vision meant. And today, we are going to talk about grow, or what DCC's main engine of discipleship is, and this is our small group ministry. And in order to do this, I want us to see what Jesus actually had to say about it. Do you think that'd be a pretty good place to start? What Jesus thinks about it? All right, so we're going to look at Matthew chapter 4, previous to what is famously called the Sermon on the Mount. We're not going to get into the Sermon on the Mount, but we're going to look right before that, Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 through 25. And then the sermon actually starts in chapter 5, and we're going to stop right before we get into the sermon, because there are some very unique things that I want you to recognize about the intentionality with the ministry of Jesus. So this is what's going on here. Jesus traveled throughout Galilee teaching in their synagogues. He announced the good news of the kingdom and healed every disease. Not some diseases. He healed every disease and sickness among the people. News about him starts to spread throughout Syria. Please understand that this is before newspapers or any form of print media. This is before television. This is before social media. All right? This is word of mouth advertising. Everyone is learning about this rabbi. People brought to him, as they're hearing about his reputation, people brought to him all of those who had various kinds of diseases. Those in pain, those possessed by demons, those with epilepsy, and those who were paralyzed and he healed them. Large crowds, this is going to be important, not small crowds, not a small group. Large crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from areas beyond the Jordan River. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, this is significant right here. When he sees the crowds and all of these people that are following him. Now, most of us in here, this would go to our head. This would make us feel pretty good about who we are, that everyone is coming from all these surrounding areas to see me or to see you. But when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he taught them, saying. Now, I'm not going to get into what he taught them saying. Whenever we get into that part, we're getting into what is referred to the Beatitudes, which is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. So the point that I want to make is what we have already read right here so far today. So Jesus is entering what we would call his public ministry. Prior to this, Jesus has been baptized. After Jesus has been baptized, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days to try to figure out exactly what he's supposed to do and how he's supposed to do that. After that, he calls these 12 disciples, which essentially what he's doing is he's creating the first small group. Verse 25 tells us that large crowds followed him from town to town. So everywhere Jesus is going, he has groups of people that are larger than the amount of people that are in this room right now, following him from town to town. But here's the thing. A lot of these people are following for the next miracle. Do you understand that? Nod your head if you understand that. They're simply following for the next miracle. They want to see what he's going to do. They're interested in shock value. They're interested in the emotional experience. They're interested in what he can do for me, or what he can do for my family, the people that I care about. This is why they're following him, for the next miracle. But they are not following him for full surrender. They are not following him for discipleship. And at the heart of the Jesus movement that all of us in here supposedly care about, or most of us in here care about, is learning full surrender and learning discipleship. These are not things that come overnight. These are things that we are taught over a period of time, but we have to be intentional about learning these things. And this brings us to the grow portion of our vision. So in week 1, Pastor Lee talked about the reach portion. It's reaching others with the gospel and love of Jesus. This means that we are trying to reach our community through the way that we do church for unchurched people. You guys filled out your cards for people that you care about, that you want to see come to know Jesus. In week 2, we talked about meeting the physical and spiritual needs of our community. This is the serve portion of our vision. And as we consider this grow portion, this is the third and final part. It's growing to become more like Jesus through small group communities. So in order to understand Destination Community Church, who we are, what we're about, this reach, serve, grow component is what you must understand. And beyond that, that's it. All right? You have to understand those three things. All right? So Jesus is going to show us very specifically what this is supposed to look like. Because Jesus separated large group and small group teaching. It's really important that you understand this. The reason that it's so important is because a lot of you understand the large group part. And the reason I know that you understand the large group part is because you're here right now, but you're not necessarily part of a small group. About a third of the people in the church are, which is still pretty good, but a lot of you are not part of a small group. And you have to have both of those. And I'm going to explain why with what we do. So Jesus considers both of these to be very important. This would fall into the large group part. And this is what this looks like in Jesus' day. If we're talking about the large group in the first century in the ministry of Jesus, we're talking about public forums like the synagogues. What did the passage tell us, right? When we looked at it, Jesus is teaching in the synagogues, or in modern day language, Jesus is teaching in the churches. But he's also teaching in city centers. He's teaching in the public square. So as you see all these miraculous healings, as you see public teaching in which there's a ton of people, this is what we're talking about. He's on a street corner talking to people. He has stepped right outside of a market. He's in a public square. He's right outside of an administrative building, whatever that might look like. It may even be the countryside in some cases that he is doing all of this work where all of these large groups are gathering, all right? I'm not taking anything away from that. It's still really important, but it's not the most important thing. And the most important thing, a lot of you that are in this room right now, you are disconnected from. And you're going to understand why it's important to be connected to this. So when we talk about the small group, we're talking about what we just talked about. Jesus is doing this ministry. Everybody is showing up. They're excited about what he's saying. They're excited about all these miracles. But what does he do? He steps away and he pulls the 12 to the mountainside. All right? You need a mountain in your life, not just a synagogue in your life. Maybe it's around a table. He has 4 or 5 of his disciples, and then as Jesus often did, he was dining with tax collectors and sinners. Maybe it's in a home. He goes over to Martha's home. He's in the home of Mary, and he's in there talking to a small group of people. All right, so this is significant. Now, what sociologists have actually done is they've developed a model for us to understand the importance of group dynamics of any size and physical space. Now, the reason that I'm sharing this with you and going to nerd out for just a minute, if you don't mind, is because this really, really applies to the church and who we are. All right, so this is what sociologists have developed. First, and I know that's probably hard to see, but that says public space. All right, public space is all about visibility. This is 70 people or more. So the atmosphere that you're in right now, that we're all in right now, would be called public space. All right? There's no intimacy within this space right now. It's a monologue, meaning I am talking to you and you are listening. But there is no real opportunity to grow together. There is really no opportunity for us to get to know one another on any kind of intimate level whatsoever. So in week 1, whenever Pastor Lee talked about the reach portion of our vision, he was talking about the public space or visibility, all right? It's important, it's really, really important, but it's not central. Next, we have what we call social space. Social space is all about availability. Visibility doesn't take a lot of effort. Availability does. You're saying, I'm available for more than the big group. So this is around 20 to 50 people. So if you think about a DCC outreach event, whenever we go somewhere to do something, if you think about one of our marriage events, if you think about our next class that we do, if you think about if we're having a Super Bowl party or a New Year's party or whatever that might look like, this is in the social space. And what it means is that you can start to develop some relationships, but you can't develop real significant relationships. Like if I'm serving alongside of Matt and we kind of get to know one another, that's not intimate, that's not close, but we're kind of getting to know one another. Now, these two spaces are really, really important. But foundationally, as far as the church is, you're here saying, you mean there's something more important than Sunday morning? There's something more important than the worship that we all gather for? I'm never going to take away from the importance of the public space. I'm never going to take away from the importance of how much this room matters in your lives and my life on Sundays. But yes, there is more important space. There is personal space. Personal space is all about accountability. So let's get down to around 6 to 12 people. It's in this size where Jesus really starts to work. It's in this size where we have the opportunity to actually get to know one another in an intimate way, in a close way. And the reality is, let's just be real, a lot of you have this experience in here in which you can hide, and you also have, there's so many Christians that don't go to church these days, they call themselves Christians, who live in complete isolation from other believers. All right? This right here, this personal space, is the bread and butter of what the church is supposed to be. All right? And then last, we have what we would call intimate space. And this is really, really important because it's about vulnerability. All right? There is zero vulnerability in the public space, unless you have the speaker that's maybe showing some vulnerability. There is zero vulnerability in the social space. But as you start to get to the personal space, and as you start to get to the intimate space, you are, in the same fashion as the disciples, you are starting to let your guard down and get to know other people on an intimate level. That is how you grow as a believer. And I have no doubt in my mind that there are some people in here that have spent 10, 15, 30, 50 years as a believer, and they've never had super close Christian relationships in their lives. Other people they can share things with. All right, now when we get down to this intimate space, suppose you have a small group and it has 6 to 12 people, or even it's a little bit larger. Suppose it has 15 people. For those of you that are in small groups, I know this because I know you, and I'm over small groups, so I know this. You have 2 or 3 people in that group, or maybe 1 or 2 people, or maybe just one, that you connect with more than anyone. And that relationship is absolutely central to your spiritual well-being. Because there is 1 to 2 people, we call 2 people a dyad, 3 people a triad. There are really, really close friends that can speak into your heart. Maybe you're in a married group, but just a couple, and you're a woman, but just a couple of the other women you're able to talk to all the time about things. So please understand this, because this is the way that the church is. Public space, very important. Social space, very important. There's so much good work that is done in social space. If you consider outreach, there is so much in public space. People coming to Jesus left and right in public space in services. I'm not taking away from those. But if you are missing the personal space, the small groups, if you are missing the intimate space in which you have those 1 or 2 close friends, because I'm not going to go around and ask people, but there are people that are in this room right now, and you would be honest enough to say that outside of my spouse, or outside of that one person that I work with, it's kind of a Christian, kind of not, just depends on what day of the week it is. I don't have that person. I don't have those people. Whenever I'm really struggling, I don't connect. And it's one of the reasons why you're one person on Sunday and someone completely different the rest of the week. Because you don't have that accountability in your life. Or you don't have those levels of vulnerability in your life. There is something special that happens in a small group that does not happen in isolation and does not happen in this room right now when there's 70 plus people. It's just a completely different experience. Whenever you share a meal with someone, or you open up and you start to talk about the struggles, the sin in your life, the kingdom starts to break in and things start to change. There are things that change that simply don't happen in this room. Now, the evangelist Mark looks at this in a lot of the same ways that Matthew does. Mark is written a little bit earlier. Because of the crowd, Jesus told us, because of the crowd. Jesus maybe was an introvert in some ways or had social anxiety. I don't know. But sometimes he didn't want to be around all those people. Right? Because of the crowd, Jesus told his disciples to get a small boat ready for him. This would keep people from crowding him. Jesus had healed many people. So those who were sick were pushing forward to touch him. People just trying to get closer and closer and closer to him. When people controlled by evil spirits saw him, they fell down in front of him to worship. The spirit shouted, "You are the Son of God." Now, most of us, that's going right here. That's going to our head. But Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him because the time is not right. Jesus went up where? On the mountainside, and he called for certain people, not just anyone, not you 6, not you 3, certain people, disciples, and they came to him. Difference in a small group, difference in a large group, difference in ways of doing ministry. In the same scenario, healing, inspiration, great wonder, amazing things. People are everywhere. But then Jesus senses that there is a limited form of learning that is going to happen on this level. So you know what I think he did? When he pulled those disciples away and when he said, get the boat ready, I think he got them together and said, this is why I'm doing the things that I just did. This is why I didn't take credit for all these things and talk about how wonderful I am. You know what you guys are supposed to do? You're supposed to emulate this. You're supposed to, as students of a rabbi, of a teacher, you are supposed to understand why I'm motivated by the things that I'm motivated by, why I'm doing things the way that I'm doing, why I'm not fighting back in the midst of all this opposition from the Pharisees and Sadducees. Follow me. Listen to me. And it's the same reason we take what we learn in the public space on Sunday mornings, and then on Sunday evenings in our small group ministry, take it to the intimate space or the personal space, so we can talk about the why of why we do these things and why Jesus teaches us. When I started at DCC, I can honestly tell you, because I was in the service for a long time before ever taking part in a small group, but my growth, I've shared this with you guys before, came as a result of being asked to be made to join part, Beth and I, in a married small group. Cindy Howard approached us in the lobby. Corey and I are starting a married small group. Would you guys join us? And if I'm to be completely honest, Beth and I felt a little bit isolated at DCC at that time. We had not made a lot of connections. We weren't completely sure over a long period of time if this would be our home church. And then we were invited into a small group. We thought it would be a wonderful thing to do. The Howards were in it. Debbie and Scott Walker, Gary and Bethany Turner, Richard and Carol Duncanson. Our marriage improved. We learned more about the Bible and more about God. We connected more to our church and started serving. Everything came about as far as growth in the right way as a result of being a part of a small group. We built life-changing relationships, and there's a reason for this. And the reason for this is this. Large groups are about proclamation. What I'm doing right now in this public space is proclamation. I'm telling you biblical truths that then you can take and apply to your life. But what you might be missing is the intimacy, because small groups are all about intimacy. You see, both were truth, and both are truth, but one is primarily a monologue, and the other is a dialogue. We want to know what you think about things. We want to know what the struggles are in your life. We want you to be able to open up and be vulnerable. And I get it. Sometimes that takes a long period of time. But it is not something that you can mess around with and just make the decision, well, that's not important. I don't have time. Jesus said, again, going back to our passage, Jesus traveled through Galilee teaching in their synagogues. He announced the good news of the kingdom, and he healed every sickness and disease among the people. So the good news is that the crowds were being drawn in. Much like the reach portion of our vision, crowds are being drawn in. Some of you may be here for the first time today, or you're pretty new at Destination Community Church, and at other churches, people are being drawn in. The bad news is disciples are not made in this environment. What do we say was the central key part of the Jesus movement? The process of making disciples. The process of making disciples. It does not happen in the public space. It happens in the intimate space. It happens in small groups. I often tell the story whenever I was the lead pastor in my first year, I started to recognize that the church was growing. We were seeing new people all the time, but a lot of these new people were not staying. They would be at DCC for a month, 3 months, 4 months, something like that, but eventually people would start to disappear. And the reason that a lot of people started to disappear, as I thought about this over and over and over, is because we had the back door wide open. And what I mean by that is that even though people might have enjoyed the services, they weren't building significant relationships. And relationships are what it's all about. So there are some of you in here, you enjoy the preaching, you enjoy the music, you feel like you've been told your whole life you should be in church, so you go to church, but you're completely isolated. Whenever you leave, you couldn't hardly name anyone that you're close to within this body. And that's where we're identifying the problem here. All right? So Jesus is all about the process of learning through relationships. When he saw the crowd, where did he go? He went up to the mountain for more intimate teaching, for closeness, for relationship building, for getting to know these 12 guys. This is the reason that he could have stayed with the crowds all the time. Listen, the crowd's where the fun is. All right, the crowd's where you get all the attention. The crowd's what stokes you up and builds your ego and does all those ugly things. He could have stayed with the crowds all day. You know, if I had a choice between healing people all the time and sitting down with 12 smelly men, and I can promise you they smelled pretty bad, I would do all the miraculous work. That's what I would like to do. But the tedious, hard stuff, he did over and over again. So please understand this, because this is the most important thing that I'm going to say this morning. More than the experience of the synagogue, we need the experience of the mountain. More than what you get on Sunday mornings here, you need the experience of a small group of 6 or 7 women, 12 guys, 3 or 4 married couples, 7 or 8 addicts, 10 or 11 parents, whatever that might look like. You need the mountainside much more than you need the synagogue. You need this intimacy. J.R. Woodward said it this way. He said, don't be fooled by church attendance, because we got huge churches growing all over the country. Don't be fooled by church attendance. Unless people are on an intentional discipleship path, they will not be shaped for God's mission in the world. Jesus spoke to the crowds, but the engine of his ministry was his purposeful gathering and shaping of the 12. You see, it wasn't the crowds that revolutionized and changed the world. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, it was the spread of the disciples' message to make more disciples. Where did they make these? What did the early church look like? Homes. Small groups of people that revolutionized and changed the world. So what is the function of our small group ministry? What does it look like? I hope you can see all of this. All right, there are 4 areas that we really focus on in our small group ministry, and I'm just going to briefly mention these. The first is community, there at the top. Excuse me. Are we really building relationships? I've said that's the central component. That's what Jesus is doing, partially what he's doing with the disciples. You see, Jesus didn't have a lot of close relationships, but he was very close to the 12. Are we building relationships? I can promise you this will always, in your life, on your deathbed, you will understand that this was more important than your drinking buddies. That this is more important than the guys that you went to watch UK football with. This is more important than your friends that you work with. This is more important than the group that you do whatever with. All right? Are we building relationships? The learning component right there. Are we studying God's truth? Are we taking what we talked about on Sunday morning and going deeper? But more importantly, applying, are we holding one another accountable? Are we giving an invitation? And sometimes this takes time. But are we giving an invitation into one another's lives to really, really talk about where we're struggling? See, you can still wear a mask in a small group. You can still go in a small group and not talk about who you really are, not open up about everything that's going on with who you are. And then the fourth component here is care. Are we looking after one another's needs? And what that means is, instead of you going to Pastor Lee, the lead pastor, with all your needs all the time, you've built such strong relationships within your small group that you have one another's backs in all scenarios and in all things that you go through. So despite what you've been told and taught over time, we don't grow in isolation. Some of you are convinced that you can come here on Sunday morning, man, that was a good sermon. Or man, the band was great today. Or man, this was good. Or man, that was good. Or man, those things were wonderful. But if you are not connecting and building real relationships. And I'm not talking about relationships with people that just happen to go to your church, that you can gossip with about everything else going on at the church. I'm talking about people who are lifting you up and not tearing other people down. Please understand that there is a very, very big difference. So what do I mean when I'm talking about intimacy? I'm talking about vulnerability. I'm talking about openness. I'm talking about a form of trust that builds over time. I'm talking about obedience. I'm talking about friendships. Just simple friendships, just new people that are allowed to speak into your life that can't be built in a synagogue. That can't be built through the reach portion of our vision. It has to be built on the mountain. So the challenge that I have for each one of you, and I know, I get it. Some of you are already locked in. Some of you are ready for your small group to start back. Some of you miss those relationships because we take a break. I get that. But for those of you that are not in that place, what I'm asking you to do today is make the mountain a non-negotiable. Make it a non-negotiable. I'm even going to go as far as to say this, and I hope Pastor Lee doesn't get mad at me, but I think he would agree that the mountain is more important than the synagogue. Do not make this something that is just, oh, well, I don't have time. It's amazing what we make time for. I don't have time to be a part of a small group. What you're saying is that your relationship with Jesus does not matter because isolation is okay. Make the mountain a non-negotiable. I've got to have this in my life. I have got to experience this. I call myself a follower of Jesus, and I can't follow if I'm simply in the synagogue and nowhere else. So the strength of DCC as we go into the future is going to depend on the mountain experience. It's going to depend on our small group ministry. So next Sunday night, we have what we have twice a year. We have our small group orientation dinner, and I get the emails for who signs up. I know a lot of you have already signed up. What I would like to ask you guys to do, for those of you that are curious, for those of you that are considering taking this challenge, what I would like to ask you to do, you don't have to do it right this second, but grab your phone, get on the app, get on destinationcommunitychurch.com, and make sure that you sign up for the small group orientation dinner. This doesn't put you in a group. This doesn't form any kind of obligation whatsoever. But what this is, it's a further explanation of what our small group ministry is. We always have great food. We always have a great time together. And I know for some of you, you would really like to do this, but there's a lot of anxiety about what to expect. There's a lot of fear because maybe you're an introvert, you have social anxiety, you're not really that great around people. I can promise you this. If you open yourself up to this, you're going to be around a lot of people that went into it the exact same way that you did. And also keep this in mind. We have no evidence whatsoever, no evidence that the chemistry of the 12 worked right away. All right, I'm saying that for a reason, because sometimes you get in a small group and you think, well, I just don't get along with these people. Or these people aren't like me, or these people aren't feeling where I'm coming from in this part of my life, or they're judging me, or they're doing this or doing that. When you are a church and when you are a small group, it takes time and effort to learn to love one another and to grow together. It doesn't always happen overnight. So before you make an excuse about yourself, consider the 12 and consider Simon the Zealot. You know why he was called the Zealot? Because he hated the Roman Empire. Now imagine if you have across the table Matthew the tax collector who is collecting taxes for the Roman Empire. All right? This is like putting the Donald and Bernie at the same table. All right? Okay, it's not that extreme. Maybe it's more extreme. All right, but this is a situation in which all of a sudden you're in a small group and you're thinking, okay, I am going to do life with these people. I am going to learn to love these people. And you know what? Sometimes the chemistry is great right off the bat. But the point is vulnerability, accountability, all of these things we must have in our lives. And I can promise you this, DCC is going to grow and be healthier and better, not on the basis of Sunday morning attendance, but on the basis of small group participation. Will you make the mountain a non-negotiable? Would you bow your head so we can pray? Father, we come to you this morning thanking you so much for continuing to take care of us, thanking you so much for continuing to be good to us. Help us to understand, Father, some of us that need to come out of that shell, some of us that are serious about following you but just not certain how to do it. God, just to take baby steps and help us to be obedient in this.